Welcome back, everyone. We're going to follow up our conversation and finish up with financing. How do we actually pay for these things? And Matt, you mentioned a lot of the different things that MBEP is doing. Farm worker housing, various studies, inclusionary ordinances. Something that I've been hearing out in the community is employer-sponsored housing. What is that? How does it work? Where have we seen it? Talk to me more about that.
Yeah, so employer-sponsored housing, what our initiative is trying to do is really trying to make sure that where there is positive traction, that we continue to build on that in terms of major employers in our region actually taking ownership over trying to create opportunities for their employees. And where the biggest element of that has been in our region has been in the agricultural community, where there's been now 2 or 3 or 4 different efforts now that have been successful in actually creating employee housing for ag workers. The largest one was an 800-bed facility in Spreckles, called Spreckles Crossing by Tanner Murray Nantle. And that has become kind of the model because it's really built at a high quality level in terms of really looking and feeling like an apartment complex, like a nice high quality development that, I would live there. It's got very livable internal spaces. It's got very strong amenities, soccer fields, barbecue areas, something that you would find at a pretty nice apartment complex if you're a renter. So that's what we're trying to achieve in terms of high quality and a standard that other folks can look at. Is it feasible for that kind of scale to be replicated all the time? No. In that case, they had access to sanitary, sewer, water source, their own land. They financed it 100% themselves, privately financed, so they didn't rely on any government subsidy. They had a lot of pushback from the community, but it wasn't immediately adjacent to a neighborhood residential, so the dynamic was acceptable in terms of the leadership and the county. In that case, it was an unincorporated county getting behind it politically. And then a lot of the other stakeholders, whether environmentalists or other business leaders, everybody really kind of rallied support for that. So we're trying to replicate that kind of effort anywhere we can. The Nunez family also developed a 600-bed facility immediately adjacent to Salinas in the Baranda community. So that's an example. Other examples beyond agriculture are also in the healthcare industry. The Central California Health Alliance came up with, has invested over $5 million in our region. One of the case in point is actually the Chinatown development, where I think it was $2.5 million that they extended early on in that process to help attract the rest of the financing, state and federal dollars that were needed. I think it was a $40 million price tag that was just mentioned earlier. So a good portion of that is coming from the employer-sponsored piece of it in terms of the healthcare industry stepping up and making that connection. And another piece here on the peninsula in Monterey, where Montage actually purchased a 32 apartment complex here in Monterey, major thoroughfare downtown, for their doctors and nurses and other pediatricians to try to make sure that they could legitimately recruit and retain some of their talent. So whether we're talking about higher earning folks, such as the doctors and nurses, or the lower earning folks in the ag industry, you can see that the major employers in our region are stepping up, and our effort is to try to capture those best practices and wherever possible remove regulatory barriers, identify other funding sources, get the right people in the right meeting to try to make sure that these kind of things move forward.
And CJ, going back to that $40 million that is the investment into the Chinatown development, Matt mentioned $2.5 million coming from an outside source, but there's a big difference between 2.5 and 40. What other kind of incentives or subsidies were used to help get that project off the ground?
Sure. For the mixed-use project called Moongate Plaza in Chinatown with Mid-Penn Housing, that was a combination of state tax credit allocation committee funding, also known as tax credits. The developer, Mid-Penn Housing, applied for the tax credits through the state and was awarded what they call a 9% tax credit award, which generates a lot of investment into a project. But other sources include local government funding that comes from, for example, the federal government through our Community Development Block Grant, also known as CDBG, and also our Home Investment Partnerships Program, which the city of Salinas is an entitlement jurisdiction, which means that we meet certain criteria per HUD, so we get an annual allocation of CDBG and home, and we use this money to leverage other financing sources such as tax credits. So when you're looking at a development, for example, you're looking at land cost, for example. In this particular case, the city of Salinas owned the land and was able to execute what we call an exclusive negotiating agreement, or in developer terms, of ENA, which gives basically a time period and puts conditions set forth between the city and Mid-Penn to perform. So the developer's got to perform certain functions. For example, there's environmental costs that have to be done, what we call a phase 1, and then a phase 2 is needed to, we take a look at the soil, we take a look at all these different parameters, right? There was existing structures that needed to be demolished to clear the site. So when we talk about financing and cost, this particular situation, there was a cost savings because the city of Salinas was able to already own the property, which is huge because land is tight and land is expensive, and was able to work with the developer per certain conditions. And then after the ENA was done, then what we call a DDLA, or a developer disposition land agreement, was performed, and then that's when we actually dispose of the property to the entity. So there's a whole process here. So pre-development costs are also studies, market studies, feasibility studies, what we call due diligence items, environmental is performed, legal fees, all these type of things. In addition to what, so once the property is identified, you have your land, you have your cost, then you have to look at your construction cost. You have to take a look at the materials. Is this going to be a stick-built project? Is this going to be modular? What is it going to entail? And this is unique because this one has a ground floor commercial retail. So what type of vendors will be in there? You know, is it going to be a cafe? Is it going to be a commercial kitchen? You know, so on and so forth. So you have to develop what we call a pro forma, financial pro forma, which is essentially an itemized budget of you estimate everything out, you know, and what your revenues will be from the rents that you can charge as well. So you look at operational cost as well, you know. And in addition to that, you also have to take a look at the financing sources because for example, the city, I mentioned CDBG and home, we put another several $1 million just from those two sources into this $40+ million project. In addition, we had some former redevelopment agency money that we were able to assist in this project. And we also did some grant, but we also did impact fee deferral as well, which is big for developers in today's day of age, where we actually allowed the developer, instead of paying for the development impact fees like traffic impact fees and regional water fee, well, regional water is different, but certain development impact fees, that we allowed them to defer those over 55 years at a simple interest rate rather than having them to front load and owe that $1 million+ up front. So that really saves the developer some cost up front. So it was a combination of fee deferrals, a combination of federal funds, a combination of grant money, a combination of tax credits, a combination of donating land and transferring it over with certain conditions. And all that came together to be able to, you know, financially sustain a development like this, because this development is going to be rented. In some cases, very little income is going to be generated for certain units, especially with the ones that we talked about earlier, the homeless population. But a lot of units in here will be extremely low, very low, low. So you have to take a look when you have these type of projects that are going to be serving multiple populations. You have to make sure that you have the operational revenue and the funding sources so it can sustain itself, because most of the requirements for these type of developments come with 55-year restrictions. That means that the development itself has to operate at those income levels in that way for at least 55 years. So there's, you know, those type of things come into play. So we were able to contribute in those type of ways to make a project like this happen.
I think that's excellent. And something that Matt said came back to me. He talked about the need for affordability, even for doctors and nurses, and I'm wondering how that connects to our first segment when we talked about that 30% threshold for housing and affordability in a general sense, and not necessarily just low income or median income housing.
Yeah, I mean, because if you're paying 30% of your income, whether it's mortgage or rent, then all these other costs as we're all incurring, whether it's your transportation, expenses, education, healthcare, investment for your kids' future. Emergencies happen all the time. So when we're paying more, when we have a cost burden, which most people do actually, especially on the coast here, paying over 50%, sometimes 60, 70% of their income, all for housing, then all these other pieces around how we consider our quality of life and our high quality of life standards really start to get significantly decreased. And I think that's what we're talking about, especially with the big gap that we have here regionally in Monterey County, where you have a lot of folks that earn at the lower end of incomes, and then you have this huge price tag for homes to purchase and for rents. And so we are one of the most, if not the most, unaffordable places in the country. And that has its impacts, and that's gonna play out at an individual, household level, and gonna, have dramatic impacts on the futures of our kids and the livability and sustainability of our workforce. So we can't all live a lavish lifestyle in Carmel or anywhere else and expect that all the workers are going to be continuously going to come from somewhere else, because at some point that's going to break down, and we're seeing it already in terms of traffic impacts, in terms of what about the parks and recreation opportunities and how the taxation works locally, the fact that there's much less percentage of open space per capita in the inland communities like Salinas versus some of the peninsula communities like Seaside and even other places where we're really having a growth and a need for more services, but not enough revenue at the local level to pay for those services. So the housing piece is center to all that, but obviously, as we're saying, we're kind of feeding off each other here. It's like there's a larger ecosystem of benefits and livability that is tied to our housing condition. And so as the housing piece, as it's suffering and we're truly in a crisis, all these other pieces are being impacted as well. It's not by itself.
You mentioned something really important there that I want to make sure gets repeated, in that the housing is kind of a central hub of all these extra things that are attached to it. And if you take housing out, you don't really have much left. You need the housing to support the people who are then accessing services. So if the housing part is suffering in any one household or for a family, they're not able to do things like spend that extra discretionary income on goods and services because they don't have any extra discretionary income. And so making sure that people are not cost burdened or extremely cost burdened in their housing means that our whole economy improves. And it also means that the roadways improve because there's less traffic when people don't have to commute an hour to get to work. And it also means that you're not paying for your roads to be repaired all the time because there are less people using them because they can walk or bike to work. And that makes our communities healthier, which means that people have fewer healthcare costs, which means that the county and the state and the federal government are subsidizing healthcare less because people are using the systems less, and just on and on and on. And so we only have a couple minutes left, and I wanted to just ask what we can do, what can the public do, both in terms of advocacy from MBAP and advocacy from the city of Salinas. What do you want people to do to make housing something that actually happens in their communities? And if you could make your best pitch in a minute, that'd be great.
Do you want to go?
Yeah, I could definitely start off. I think what I would do is encourage, for those that are watching out there, I would encourage you to get involved and get involved with attending city council meetings, attending planning commission meetings. I know the city of Salinas has a lot of plans going on right now. We talked about the regional fair housing plan. We have an Alisal vibrancy plan. We just did a downtown housing target market assessment. We have the future growth area. These are big, high level things we did in the inclusionary ordinance, and we really want to encourage the members of the public to attend council, give public input, give public comment, to get involved in, and if there's any advisory groups, technical advisory groups, or any other public meetings, sub-public meetings, to really just get involved. The members of the public really have a voice, and I would encourage them to come out and talk to their leaders in the community.
Thank you, CJ. Matt?
Yeah, I think the first thing is folks that live here in this great country, we need a vote. Folks that can need to register to vote, need to vote. We have that coming up right now in terms of Propositions 1 and 2 on the ballot. And in terms of at the local government level, each of our communities, we have the opportunity to vote in folks that support a sensible housing agenda. And there's solutions on the table, and some candidates are much more advanced in terms of their advocacy. So I think that is where I'm hoping, and to double down on what I just heard from CJ, is there's lots of ways to get involved, and in terms of a crisis that we have on housing, it's all hands on deck. And there's lots of ways, whether it's letter campaigns, you don't even have to move from your chair, you can do that. There's internet, there's social media, there's ways to connect with your elected officials, your neighbors, all the way up to attending or even participating in some of these advocacy efforts directly. And please visit our website as another example. You can join our Action Center, and we engage periodically, continuously in policies and projects that are going to move us forward in terms of increasing the affordable housing supply in our region.
Well, thank you both, CJ and Matt. You guys are outstanding. We've heard about what affordable housing is, where it is, how we pay for it, how we get involved. All of this is great information, and I would encourage anyone to go to the City of Salinas website, go to the MBEP website, MBEP, MBEP, and learn about what it is we can do to make this conversation turn into action. I'm Jon Wizard. This has been YourTownTV. Thanks for joining us today.